So, good morning, everyone. So today is a 1 hour and a half long session regarding employment in Japan, how to prepare for it, and how important Japanese is. And I have three different slides, so you're going to hear me talk a lot. So I hope I won't bore you, but yeah. So this is the first thing we're going to be talking about. I'll be talking about understanding Japanese employers as the first one. Then I'll be talking about how not to sabotage yourself, because there is a lot of student sabotage regarding job hunting in Japan. And then after that, I'll be talking about specifically what to do if you're job hunting without strong Japanese, or is that really the correct way of doing things? So, yep, this is the first slide, understanding Japanese employer. Yeah, so this is so just a bit of a self-introduction. I am Singaporean, as Nizawa Sensei has introduced me just now. I am currently the MEXT Scholars Association president. I often lecture about foreign student careers. I did one session 2 days ago, and one more session at the end of the month, actually. But this is not my main work. My main work is being a engineer, but I also do freelance work. So I was also a foreign student as well. So I've been through the process. Actually, a bit more about that later. And because I lead a student organization and I do lecture about it, right? Hopefully I can give you some perspective about things. There's also my blog down there. I haven't written anything for a year and a half, but the thing is that, like, supposedly it's a good resource still. So if you want to take a look take a look at my blog regarding things about, let's say, whether there's lots of topics that I've written about, including, for example, what to do if you have working experience overseas in Japan, overseas, and you want to job hunt in Japan. These kind of things are have articles on the blog. So just take a look at them if you're interested. So I just want to start by talking about this. When we look at employment, we need to think that employment is a two-way street, right? You don't get employed just because you want to get employed, just because you want to get a good job. You get employed because you want to get a job and somebody wants to give it to you. And therefore, for somebody to job hunt, it is very important to understand what the other party wants. And in this particular case, what the other party wants refers to what does the Japanese or employer in Japan, what do they want from a foreign student here? And generally speaking, there are three main types regarding what kinds of companies will tend to hire foreigners. So this is pretty much the main groupings of them. The biggest is because they would want foreigners who can beat the Japanese at their own game, or be as or how should I put it? Beat the competition on fair terms in the typical job hunting process. There are two other sub kinds of categories. The first one is where companies are specifically wanting foreigners, and the second one is where nationality doesn't matter. But those we will go into later on. I want to talk mainly about the thing in the middle, because the thing is that the thing in the middle about the typical job hunting process and equals beating the Japanese at their own game is pretty much the most common way that foreign students will get a job in Japan. And because of this, it's important to start looking at this specifically. So let's start with the average kind of employer in Japan and how they will employ foreign students on average. So for some people who are already in the know about how things work in Japan regarding employment, you may have discovered a few things which may surprise you. Have you ever wondered why, generally speaking, in Japan, your grades don't really matter? How is it that the subject field, what you study, doesn't really affect your employment that much? Less so for PhDs, but the thing is, definitely this applies more for bachelor's and master's. And honestly, so I mentioned just now that I'm an engineer, right? But as introduced by Nizawa Sensei, my major was politics. And so therefore, this is something that you won't really find that much outside of Japan, but this is something that you will find quite commonly in Japan. But on the other hand, why is school name so important in Japan? That's another factor, right? They don't look at what you study, but they look at your school name. There's also another thing. Why do you think that long-term employment exists in Japan? So all these questions tie back into the overall idea of what of what fresh graduate recruitment is in Japan and what the general structure is. And to summarize what it usually is compared to, how it usually like it's talked about, the question is, this is a good metaphor for how the Japanese employer generally and traditionally thought of their fresh graduates. What you see down here is a blank piece of paper and a pen. Generally speaking, the idea behind the Japanese fresh graduate way of recruitment is that companies want fresh graduates to be good white sheets of paper, and they want to be the pen to write on them, to write like a script on them, like basically develop them in their own way. What we call this potential based hiring. This is the backbone of Japanese fresh graduate employment, and also pretty much what the backbone of Japanese overall traditional employment is. Instead of looking at what you come into the company with, the focus is on ensuring that you have the highest potential possible at the point that you enter, so that you can be trained. Because of this, the idea is therefore that they want their fresh graduates to stay in their company for a very long time, so that they can keep training you. And because of this is also why teamwork and cohesion are important factors that come into play. Because the thing is, it's not so much about what you bring immediately; it's about how long you stay, how well you work with other people, how much they can invest into you. So that is the abstract, the principle of things. But what does this actually mean when Japanese companies start like hiring, or they choose to hire, and how does this apply to foreign students? So if you look at this survey, this is about 5 years ago, but most people in foreign student HR will agree that things haven't really changed that much. Now, if you see that here in this survey, what do foreign what's it called, companies hiring foreign students look out for when they are hiring foreign students? You see the survey results here. Note that the green is arts and humanities, and the blue is STEM, i.e. your science and technology and math subjects. Number one is Japanese. Number two is communication skill, ability to cooperate, basic intelligence, and a specialist knowledge. Note that even for STEM subjects, students, right? You would think that for STEM subjects they would want your specialist knowledge, right? But far more important that to the typical Japanese employer is Japanese and communication skill. This is a reflection of what I mentioned just now regarding how it is long-term employment with teamwork and cohesion and training, and the ability to be trained. So this is the structure for it. Now, you will probably be curious as to how much Japanese do the typical employer, Japanese as a typical employer want in Japan. And we have separate results for that. This is done by Recruit in 2 years ago. And the thing is that you see the results down here. 30% of Japanese employers would require a minimum of N1. Around half would say a minimum of N2. N3 is around 20%. And then for N4 and N5, you have 2.4% each. So of course, if you ask like the Japanese employers what they prefer, they would pretty much say N1. So the more important thing down here is the minimum level. The point that we want to emphasize down here is that Japanese is definitely an important factor in how much of the Japanese job market you can access. And to summarize the graph just now, N3 is where significant numbers of employers start considering your profile. N2 is where the majority start considering you. On the other hand, though, I do want to say that this 5% down here is not little. It is because, after all, we're talking about 5% of the third largest economy of the world, right? So there is still a chance for people without strong Japanese to find a job in Japan, but there is this amount of the market on the left that you can access if you have better Japanese. So that is pretty much what the statistics say. Now, I just want to go a bit more into what we have down here. And in terms of like the communication skill. Now, do American companies not want people with communication skills? The answer is clearly everyone wants people with communication skills, right? And the same thing here. Do American companies or some other countries' companies not want people with the ability to cooperate? No, of course they want people with ability to cooperate, but we need to interpret these factors in the Japanese context of long-term employment, in the context of the system where you will run through different departments 2 or 3 years at a time. So this communication skill and ability to cooperate is pretty much something to do with the way that the Japanese employers' workplaces usually work. And on that note, we need to think about what they do not want. So the communication skill and the ability to cooperate is an indicator of what the Japanese employer tends not to want. So the first thing is that that more so than in other countries, Japanese employers are quite sensitive to people joining and quitting, which is why if you actually go to an interview in Japan, with a traditional company, and they ask you, how long do you plan to stay in Japan? If you say anything less than, let's say, 20 years, right, this is a high chance for disqualification immediately. Why? Because, as I mentioned before, they are looking at people who can stay within the company for 10, 20, even until retirement. This is traditional, but it's still the majority. They are also looking for signs, or they are looking at red flags or yellow flags for whether you're going to come in and cause friction. Remember that Japan is still quite quite a social rule-based society, and therefore you coming like somebody coming in to cause friction is definitely not welcome. But how do you go above and beyond that? How do you assuage or like lessen these kinds of worries? Basically by showing that you are well integrated in Japan, with or without Japanese. This can involve basically recommendations from members of Japanese society, including your professors. This can involve club activities, your bukatsu and your sakura in your universities. These are indicators as for an employer as to whether you are well versed or you have experience in Japanese society and the group dynamics that happen within Japanese society. And this is also why interview technique is very important in Japan, because the thing is that there are all these small signs that they are looking out for. And these are things that people will not recognize or will not remember by themselves. And therefore, this is also why I do recommend working with a foreign student recruiter or a headhunter who is incentivized to actually develop your interview technique when you're doing your job hunting. So back to this, right? I just want to summarize, like, of like what exactly these results show about Japan. So we look at this and we see that there are pretty much 3 factors to it. The first thing is language, the second thing is your soft skills, and the third thing is your hard skills. Your language is important. The more of the Japanese language that you have, the better. The more that you will be able to access employers who will even take a look at your profile. In most, I can tell you that in most job hunting profiles for foreign students, there is a part where you put in like your JLPT level. And this is a factor which companies use to automatically filter out applications. So yes, please be aware of this. Second thing about soft skills means understanding and being able to deal with Japanese teamwork and culture. What are employers looking out for here? Are they looking for your enthusiasm as to whether you want to be part of Japanese society and a Japanese company? It is also about the awareness of Japanese culture and your commitment to staying where you are. And the hard skills are, I just want to say that this is more important than the survey suggests. Uh, Especially for STEM subject people, generally speaking. Now, if you are going to be applying for a chemistry job in a chemical company, and you do not have some form of a chemical degree, you will find it hard to be even accepted in the first place into interview process, right? So yes, so these things are important, especially for specialist fields. But they function as a minimum for you to get your foot in, but not something for you to shoot the moon or win the job hunting process with exceptions. But yeah, this is the overall framework that I want you to think about regarding what Japanese employers want. Now, when I talk about all this, it is kind of easy for people to think that, oh, this means that, that probably there's going to, there's so many rules and whatsoever. I do think we need to recognize the pluses of the Japanese fresh graduate hiring system, because when we talk about this, it sounds really troublesome, right? It sounds very mendokusai. But the pluses are also present. The pluses are also present in two factors. Number one is that if you look at the left, and this is actually a result that has been born over the past 5 years, 90% of bachelor's graduates, and actually more than 85% of graduate school graduates already have job offers by the time they graduate. This is probably the highest that you will find in the developed world. Part of this is because of the lack of young people in Japan, but part of it is also because of the fresh graduate hiring system shielding and protecting fresh graduates from competition at the mid-career level. Notice that in most of your countries, when you go back home and you try to drop hunt, then you drop hunt for a entry-level position. Entry-level positions are also free for mid-career people to apply to, right? In Japan, you are shielded. And that shielding is actually very advantageous for fresh graduates by ensuring that you have a good place for you to compete with fellow fresh graduates instead of competing with people with experience. The second thing is that the flexibility within subjects can be a very good thing as well. Because in my case, for example, me being able to become an engineer, that was definitely a good thing. So these are the kinds of factors where we look at the Japanese system and you're like, there's a lot of things which are frankly quite weird about it. But there are benefits as well. But I think the bigger concern that many of you will have is the question of whether, looking at all this, do I have to fit a box? Do I have to wear a recruit suit? Do I have to do I have to bow 90 degrees to the 90 degrees to the interviewer and these kind of things? The answer is maybe, but maybe not. What I just explained is the average Japanese employer and how they approach employment. But the thing is that the forest is not the trees. Because the average doesn't mean that every single thing within that forest is the same, right? And in terms of employment, you are not looking for the whole forest. You don't get employed to the whole forest. You get employed to one tree. So you're looking for one employer amongst everyone that actually will fit your goals and what you want to do. So this is the point for why we need to look at not just the average, but the other two kinds of things and the other kinds of small traits and small clues that you may be able to have for getting an employer in Japan. Let's start from the top right one. Specifically wanting foreigners. There are companies in Japan who actually prefer, at least for a portion of their hiring, right, foreigners over typical Japanese fresh graduates. But so the question is, where is it that foreigners are stronger or seem to be stronger than Japanese? This is the kind of logic that you kind of need to think of in job hunting for you to target your job search better. So let's look at a few factors. Now, where is it that foreigners are stronger than Japanese? Foreigners are generally stronger than Japanese at foreign languages. Foreigners have overseas connections more so than a typical Japanese student. there are cases where foreigners may demonstrate a better culture fit in a company versus a typical Japanese student. This strangely does happen actually, and where if it's a company that tends to do things a bit less regimented, and this does happen especially in maybe like the way that I work in the startup field, for example. So these are the rough ideas of where foreigners as a whole can be stronger. But then the other question comes about, what kinds of companies tend to have these kind of traits? It's pretty much these. So remember that it's language, your culture fit, and your overseas connections, right? So these kinds of strengths are best suited for companies with this kind of profile, where they are expanding overseas, especially when they are in the process of expanding overseas and they're trying to hire people to help them. Whether they are, or they maybe already have overseas offices. Sorry, like overseas branches is a repeat. There's also industry quirks. Tourism, yes, definitely. In fact, tourism right now is extremely short of people because of what happened during COVID. And import and export to some extent, yes. Strangely, recruitment has lots of people who are not working in who are not working in Japanese, and there are lots of foreigners you'll find down there because of there's a whole other story behind that. But yes, we also actually have decent numbers of foreign founded companies in Japan. More so in the big cities than outside in the rural areas. But yes, and many of these foreign founded companies may appreciate somebody who actually comes from the same background. Just a word of caution though. Many of these companies will not be as strict in Japanese as the typical Japanese company. But it doesn't mean that they have no minimum requirement. Why? Because the thing is that if you, for example, still have to do Japanese administration, somebody having Japanese is still going to be advantaged. If you have Japanese team members, the fact that you can speak Japanese, if you can speak Japanese, is definitely a plus. So yeah, that's one thing. So the second subtype that I talked about was where nationality does not matter. And nationality does not matter is you don't really have that many cases, but the most obvious example in this day and age is coding. We have a lot of people in Japan who are working as programmers and who do not and who do not actually speak a lot of Japanese. Why? Because code is code. Code is code, and therefore whether you speak Japanese when you code or whatsoever is not that relevant to many companies. As long as, even if you do not speak Japanese, as long as your manager speaks English, right, you know, this is perfectly doable. And so there are kind of other examples as well, design to some extent, but design is highly culture specific as well. I can imagine how, of course, like, you know, if it's translation kind of fits, but that also requires Japanese. So yes, so these kind of things, maybe accounting, for example, right? So that's the kind of like that's the kind of examples that I can give for this. But what the overall trend of logic is in here is that the shape of the company, what they do, who they are founded by, all these things are important factors to look at when it comes to examining and analyzing a company's needs, and therefore the kinds of foreign students or foreigners they would want to hire. So let's try applying this kind of logic through looking at some case studies. So I have 4 case studies here, which I hope that you can try to use some of the logic that I just gave you just now to kind of let you think about what kinds of foreign students or foreigners they would tend to hire. So the first thing is, let's say we have this all these examples are based off true true examples I know in my work, for by the way. So yeah, these are actually based off real life examples. So strategic consulting firm A has a payroll of above 1,000 people. They are aware of the need to globalize. They're a big name in Japan, but not so overseas. So they're making their first efforts at expanding overseas, and therefore they're looking for talent. What kind of foreign students do you think that they will need? This was the rough profile that they tended to look at. So they're looking at bilinguals, including non-Japanese native foreigners. And notice that it's bilingual, which means that they needed people which are confident in both languages. Why? Because even if you are hired for even if you are hired as part of the overseas expansion team, right? You as a consulting firm, there is a high possibility that you would still need to deal with Japanese clients. So therefore, bilingualism was important. Consulting as overall, from what I observed, though, does have a heavy preference for brand name schools. It's just the way that the industry works. So yeah, that's one other factor. The generalist to be is what I mentioned just now about the potential based hiring. Yeah, so that's another factor that they tend to be, but not really the students with weaker school names. That's pretty much how consulting tends to work. Startup B, this actually it fits very well with my first job. 40 to 50 people, provides a web service in Japanese, product manager speaks English, has plans to expand into wider Asia in the future. So what kind of people do you think this company tends to want to hire? The answer is that the top priority tends to be for developers, because developers are extremely in demand, and I mean developers as in programmers, are extremely in demand right now. And whether they speak Japanese or not, it's not a must. It is better, but it is not by no means a must in terms of what they are looking to hire for. Maybe for digital marketing and design and growth hacking experience, all these things you can, there is a possible way for people to, without that strong Japanese, to actually get into the company. And because of overall expansion, whether if you speak Korean and Mandarin, that's definitely a plus, especially if we're doing the business side. Note that this is a company, as an example of a company which does not follow the model which I explained just now regarding potential-based hiring. The smaller the company, the less likely the company has the resources to fully train you from the beginning for what the typical Japanese company does for 3 or 6 months. Smaller companies tend to prefer people who want to work hard and can deliver the very day that they enter the company. So as I mentioned just now, just because the overall Japanese model works in one way does not mean that every single company in Japan works a certain way. So yes, this is one example. So the third example is an FMCG manufacturer. This is FMCG refers to fast-moving consumer goods. This is your shampoo maker, the shampoo maker, and maybe retailer. No, sorry, the maker, not the retailer. The maker. So your shampoo, your body soap, these kind of things. So this is an international company, but the Japanese office mainly deals with domestic sales and marketing. Everyone knows this company. So what kind of people do you think that this international company tends to hire for? You would be surprised, but this is the rough profile that they tend to hire for. Number one is bilinguals, but the Japanese must be at native level. And also, proper Japanese mannerisms is a big plus. And well, generalist to be yes, but foreign students not demonstrating a native level in Japanese, right, are probably not lower on their hiring in priority. Now, why is this so? You would think that because they're an international company, right, they would want foreign students, right? But the answer is actually no. These companies, this company works mainly with domestic sales and marketing, which means that their Japanese office mainly does Japanese business. And because their Japanese office does Japanese business, they will want people with native level Japanese and the ability to fit with Japanese society and business immediately. And also because many of these foreign companies, if they wanted somebody who only spoke Japanese who only spoke English with a foreign background, they can they can ask the people to come from overseas. Often that happens. So the thing is that just because a company is an international company does not mean that they are looking for internationals. So that's a bit of like the part that people need to work on, need to be aware of. The last thing is Japanese manufacturer D. This is a large corporation with very well known in both inside and outside of Japan. The R&D division is bilingual, and they have factories in Southeast Asia. What kind of students do you think they will be hiring for? So their top priority in terms of R&D, because R&D is like proper talent in R&D is short in demand, right? Like so technicians or research and development people, regardless of the Japanese ability, are fine. I mean, research is research, right? But even if they talk about things in English, whether you can actually demonstrate like good teamwork in the Japanese sense may be noted and may be a factor or consideration. Of course, if the company tends to work with like individuals doing research, that's not really that much of an issue. So that's the first thing. They will also tend to look at the nationalities where the factories that they already have or have expansion plans to where they're located, and who can be generalists to be because they want just you to stay for a long time, 10 years at least, maybe. But because it's a Japanese company and maybe like, except for the technicians and the research students, they would still be defaulting to the overall hiring mode of non-Japanese fluent foreign students, of not really looking at foreign students without Japanese. So that's pretty much the thing. So these are 4 case studies, all of which, because their business is different, their hiring needs are also different, and therefore that pretty much may give you yourself a clue as to whether like, you fit a company or whether they're looking for a profile like yours, especially regarding the Japanese element. So the point I want to end off for this first part of the presentation is you need to understand each employer to find your fit. There is a lot more than what the average suggests. And so that's one thing that I think I want to talk about for now. Then I'm going to go to my next presentation, which is about foreign students sabotaging themselves, which is actually a very, very common thing that people do. And let's look at so here's the thing, and this is more of like a what not to do session regarding like your job hunting. So the problem is that, honestly speaking, like, well, foreign students are generally quite talented. For people who come all the way from a foreign country into Japan, into a language that you don't really speak, right, needs some sort of like, like guts actually. And so, but the thing is that maybe it's because of that many foreign students, because they don't really know the job hunting process very well, end up sabotaging themselves. And it's a bit strange because in job hunting, you want to be the bomb, but you don't want to bomb yourself. But many people bomb yourselves. So let's look a bit into this session about why and how people bomb themselves, and so that you can think about how you can avoid bombing yourself. So this is like, and I skip this, and like, yeah, please look at my blog and stuff like that. Yeah. And so as I mentioned, why I choose this topic is because it's actually very common for people to start bombing themselves. And these are the 5 ways that I generally see that students kind of bomb themselves. So the thing is that please do not do this kind of thing. But I will look at each of these individually. But just for you to have an overall idea, do not start too late. Do not think about only what you want, but not employers want. Do not generalize. Do not overthink your first job, and do not ask for help. Basically, ask for help, please. And let's start from the first thing, which is actually the most common mistake for foreign students, especially foreign students who are not that aware of the Japanese job hunting process. We know that in English, we have this proverb called The early bird gets the worm. But how early? Be aware that the job hunting process in Japan for the majority of companies follows a certain schedule. And this schedule is called the Shinto Tsusayo schedule, or like, like Shinto Tsusayo schedule, or like in the fresh graduate job hunting schedule. And the vast majority of companies do follow it. And this is when you generally do your job hunting, generally, with exceptions. If you graduate in spring, most job hunting processes start in the February of the year that you of the year before you graduate. However, there are exceptions to this because foreign companies, the gaishike, tend to even start one semester before. So your job hunting, if you're looking for specific companies, can start as early as 3 semesters before you graduate. And once the door is shut, it is shut, except for maybe some exceptions if we can get in from the back doors or the side doors, but that's not today's content. So yes, for autumn graduates, 2 semesters is also a good guideline. 1 semester is also possible. Basically, for autumn graduates, you need to think of yourself as if you were a spring graduate of the following year. If you graduate in September 2024, your typical job hunting process functions the same as a spring graduate of 2025. And then you do things before, and then you work backwards. So that's a rough idea. Do note that in Japan, there is also a special visa class for, let's say that you apply to a company and say, we only accept fresh graduates in spring. And then so you graduate in August, right? So what do you do in that half year? There is a visa class for people who are awaiting a job offer to stay within Japan and be able to do baito as long as it's shikakugai katsudo, right? So this does exist. So like, you can job hunt as if you were a spring graduate for the next year, which is generally how you want to do it. So yeah, so that's the rough schedule. Now, if you are already late, there are a few ways that you can approach things. Number one is small and medium companies tend to be much more flexible with their job hiring. Even for big companies, if you look for autumn recruitment, akisayo in Japanese, if you Google tsunen sayo, year-round recruitment, or akisayo in Japanese, there are decent numbers of companies which actually do hire for the autumn or do hire year-round. And yes, there's like in the small and medium companies. There's also a few backdoors. If you have a good referral network, then maybe referrals. Then of course we have Boston Career Forum as one of the examples of the biggest backdoor in the world. But be aware, Boston Career Forum is in Boston, but it's very Japanese. So the thing is that without strong Japanese, you will not have a high success rate. Is a general idea. But yes, the idea is this: be aware of the Japanese job hunting schedule. Try your best to fit with it. If you are already late, there are other ways for you to do things. So don't despair, but if you are not there yet, try your best to keep to the job hunting schedule. The other thing that is very common is for foreign students and Japanese students as well, actually, to, in recruitment, only think about what you want. Because job hunting is actually a compromise. It is not, as I mentioned before, you don't get a job because you want a job. You get a job because you want a job and your employer wants to give you a job. And so be aware that even though you may think that it's your dream company, are you the dream employee for that company is a whole other issue. And to be honest as well, the majority of Japanese companies have no experience hiring foreigners. And I remember there was a 2017 MyNavi survey, and this was 6 years ago, so things would have moved a bit back then. But at that point of time in 2017, right, only around 1/5 to a quarter of Japanese companies had experience hiring foreigners with a JLPT level of N2 and above. This is a quarter. That means the other 3 quarters have not hired a single, like, foreign student or foreigner with at least without an N2, without even with an N2. The number of Japanese companies which have hired, which at the point of 2017, hired a foreign student without an N2 was around 3%. So that was 2017. So this is the point that there are many companies which you may think are good companies, but may not consider you, in all honesty. And this includes the gaijiketing thing that I told you about just now. Just because that they are internationals does not necessarily mean that they want internationals without native level Japanese. Okay, so there's also a flip side. So these are the kinds of companies which you want who may not want you, but there are many other companies which you may not want at this point of time, but may actually want you. So there's a few common examples of where employees or job seekers tend to forget. The first one is B2B firms. So this is I'm not sure how many people know of this, but like B2C is business to consumer. This is your basically things like, let's say, your Rakuten, your Rakuten and things like that, things that you consume. Even your gyudon is considered to be, your beepos are considered to be business to consumers. But what about the companies which supply Yoshinoya and Skiya the machines to cook? What about the transportation companies which deliver their ingredients? These are business to business, B2B companies, right? These tend to be underapplied to. Why? Because everybody knows Google, everybody knows Skiya, everybody knows your Gyomu Supa, for example, right? We know these companies, therefore we find them close to us, and we think that, and we recognize them, and therefore they have a brand to us. But because we ourselves are not necessarily in that form of business, we do not actually know where the big players of certain fields of business are. And because of this, B2B firms tend to have lower numbers of applicants to job ratios, especially at the fresh graduate and early career segments. So you may want to look at B2B companies. Secondly, the thing is that, like, one very common mistake that people have is that your industry does not necessarily affect the hiring per se. I put Google as an image down there because the idea is that Google is a tech company, but do they only need tech people? The answer is no. They need HR people, they need sales people, they need customer support people, and all these kind of things. Just because a company is in a certain industry does not affect necessarily that they are only hiring for a certain people. Cosmetic companies do not necessarily only hire beautiful people. Basically, that's the idea. So do not limit yourself to a certain kind of to saying that, oh, this industry doesn't work for me because I'm not a certain kind of person, I don't have certain skills and these kind of things. This is basically you limiting your own job pool. So please don't do that. And also, don't forget that startups can be good places. And this actually goes into what my own experience is, but a bit more about that later. Yeah. So please also understand that interview technique is important both outside and inside Japan. When a company is asking you, so why did you apply here? They are not asking you for why literally you're applying there. They're asking you for how your interests align with their interests. This is why if you take the questions of why did you apply here too literally, you may answer the top answer. This is because your company has work from home policies is one condition I'm looking for. No, this is pretty much this answer is probably going to be a disqualifier in an interview. What they are actually asking for is how your interests align with how you will perform, how you will contribute, which is why please understand that your interview technique is very important. Yes, and that companies are not asking questions very literally. They're asking questions with a bit of meaning. This is why the question I asked just now, how long do you think you'll stay in Japan for? What they're actually asking you is not how long you will stay in Japan for, but how long you will commit to their company. So understand the hidden meanings behind questions. Important. So the second thing is do not generalize. Now, and as a foreigner who's also working in Japan right now, I think I understand it because don't really want to be in the working situation of this, right? I mean, honestly, I don't want to. You don't want to either. But this is one common thing that will happen in Japan, but it does not have to be your Japan. I want to emphasize that. For me, my own experience as well, my first employer was a startup that actually only had around 20 people when I joined. And the thing is, there was almost no overwork, no overtime. And yeah, it was no suits actually because I was an engineer and these kind of things. So so even within Japan, there is a spread. And sometimes within that spread, you need to kind of think about the way that the best employers are often the not the most obvious employers. In fact, the most obvious employers tend to have tons of people applying for them, which makes them hard to even get into the first place. So it may be important for you to start digging around for less obvious places, startups, SMEs, employers not in the main cities, for example, for you to maybe find your best fit. Next point. Do not overthink your first job. This is very common because when we think about our first job, the whole wish list comes out. You want a gaishike with good work-life balance, with a good salary, with a housing allowance, with the ability to not wear like a stuffy suit every day and yada yada yada. Wait. It's good to know what you want, but if you are not going to be the perfect employee, you are probably not going to be looking for the perfect employer. And that's the thing. Remember, as I said, job hunting and employment is always a compromise. And what I mean is this, I don't mean that you can't aim for these things, but whether you want to do that at the fresh graduate stage is a very different question. I will be honest as well, around half of foreign students are likely to quit their first job in the first 3 years. And because of this, we need to think about things like that your employment, in terms of your employment, right? Your first job is unlikely to be your only step and your only employer in your own life. And therefore, do you really need to be that strict about things regarding your first employer? Is it more important for your first employer to lead to your next employer rather than it being a perfect employer in itself? So these are the questions. So to kind of talk about things in a more concrete term, remember that you're more likely to quit your first job than otherwise. So think about whether it's a good place to move from. That's probably more important because think about whether it has a brand name, whether it will give you skills and experience. Will you have responsibilities that will lead to a better job hunting, mid-career job hunting in the future? So that's one thing. The second thing is Daini Shintotsu. Japan has a system where fresh graduates who want to switch jobs within the first 2 or 3 years, right, have a separate thing called Daini Shintotsu where you can go into a company. You can go into a different company. It's kind of like a semi-shinsotsu, semi-fresh graduate. And because of this, even if you have a not so good employer in your first employer, right, you actually can switch jobs relatively easily, even at the early stage. So do not take your first employer as this thing that you need to aspire to, that you need to ask perfection from. That perfection you can develop later on in your career. Think of your career as a long journey with multiple steps. So that's my advice. So last thing is for this section is please ask for help. Help is very important. Help is very important, especially because if you don't speak proper Japanese, even if you don't speak proper Japanese, having help that can help you, let's say, write things or just give you some interview coaching can be a huge help when it comes to your job hunting. But it's all these kind of things, basically. Your the Japanese friends, your senpais and other foreigners working in Japan, particularly other foreigners working in Japan. For other foreigners working in Japan probably have a decent network of companies which may consider your profile and some interview tips which they have found to be useful regarding job hunting in Japan. Recruiters, as I mentioned before, these are like, your ryugakusei recruiter, ryugakusei headhunter, and like the jinsai shokai. So these are HR professionals, and they are doing the recruiter job. These recruiters are actually very well placed because they are well placed to help you with your interview preparation, your resume writing, and all these kind of things. The same thing with your school's career offices as well. So yes, have you been approaching these people? Do you have these people in around you? And if you do not, you better make them, because the thing is, this kind of help can make or break someone's job hunting. So that's all I have for this presentation. I have one last one before I go on into the Q&A, which specifically talks about job hunting in Japan without Japanese, and some points to note. I've already gone through the background statistics here. I just want to refresh them with you, that you remember that how important your Japanese and your communication skills are. And that you remember that this slide is basically was talking about how, again, N3 is when significant numbers of employees start considering you. N2 is when the majority. But there's still a little sliver of that 5%. But I want to go a bit more into the why. Because think about it, why are Japanese companies so particular about Japanese? I mean, shouldn't they internationalize? That's a valid question. It's a valid question, but there is logic behind this. I personally do think that Japanese companies are a bit too particular on the levels of Japanese that they demand, but there is a proper reasoning for why Japanese is important in Japanese companies. So before I go into the reasons, I want to say that none of the following is an accusation or finding fault with the job seeker. However, they are things to be aware of in order for you to be able to strategize or prove your worth to Japanese companies. So let's look at some of the reasons for why Japanese companies are quite hesitant to hire somebody without strong Japanese. So for the typical Japanese company, hiring somebody without formal Japanese or like strong Japanese will lead to higher administrative costs. That cost these are things like, okay, so you want a contract in English. Who translates it? Somebody has to translate it within the company, right? That's a cost. That's time that employee could be using in some other work. There's also a higher chance of intra-company miscommunication risks, not just language, but because language in itself is already difficult, but cultural, cultural risks, just because, and of course, generally speaking, the better Japanese that you are, the more aware you tend to be about Japanese cultural rules. So these are already costs. Let's say that they hire you, and let's say you do international trade. Sure, okay, but international trade as the whole department isn't going very well, and therefore they want to redeploy people. Now, even if you were performing well within that role as an international trade person speaking English, right? Your limited deployability afterwards in a different department is a form of a risk that the company will have to take on. And therefore, they are also, again, more hesitant. But there's also general fears. What I wrote down there is actually a very commonly expressed statement. Employers will not tell you this to your face, but it's actually something that people will think about. You've been here for how long in Japan already? Like, why is the Japanese still at N5 or below? It's a common question. It's a common question, and you may have answers to it, but the thing is that answer will not come out through your resume. It's just a matter of an impression. The impression that you give and what are the costs that employers will perceive from you. So this is half of the equation. We are talking about fears and costs. Generally speaking, somebody without strong Japanese or around N3, right, will lead to increased fears and costs for employers. But there is a way to get above this. It's called your value. And if you have high value, and if your value is stronger than your perceived costs and fears, then you will get a job. So how do you actually square this then? It's very like your job hunting process, therefore, that has to revolve around increasing your value and lowering the fears and costs that companies may have regarding your you employing you. So when we talk about increasing value, it's not that hard. It's very simply, do you have a skill which is highly in demand, or can you develop one? I have to say that right now in this current world, that often means going for a coding boot camp, or learning programming or learning data science, because that's the world that we live in right now. Second thing, what kinds of companies would value your background, companies expanding your country? This is what I mentioned in my first presentation. So if you increase your value, you are more likely to increase to assuage or compensate for the fears and costs that they may have with hiring you. The other way of doing things is lowering the fears and costs. Even if you do not have N2, showing that you are actively making an effort. This can involve doing some tips and tricks. Even if you're an entry, if you send in a handwritten ES, or an entry sheet like in Japanese, or of course corrected by somebody else, right? That is the kind of effort that employers, if they take a look, right, may appreciate from somebody as a sign that they are willing to work hard. So these are the ways that this is one way. The second thing is links to Japanese society. Have you been volunteering in Japanese society? Do you come in from a referral from a member of Japanese society? These, even if you don't speak proper Japanese, having somebody who, showing that you have been actively participating in Japanese society is one way of compensating for the language in itself. And of course, there's other kinds of companies which will not face that many cost hiring non-Japanese fluent foreigners. Once again, this does not mean gaishike. It does not necessarily mean gaishike, but this can mean, for example, foreign-founded companies. In fact, if you go Google search for nationality founder Japan or something like that, you may find the list, or those are the kinds of places that you may want to consider. There's also a bit of a how. For people who do not speak fluent Japanese, generally speaking, referrals and internships are usually easier ways for you to show your value than normal hiring methods. Which is why, especially for people who do not speak normal fluent Japanese, right, your out of school network is very important, because that recommendation, or that kind of people saying that I learned about this job for you, do you want it? This can be extremely important in the case of people who do not speak fluent Japanese. Also note that if you do not speak normal Japanese, your typical job fairs where Japanese students tend to participate in, right, probably not that good places for you to job hunt. Instead, foreign student aimed job fairs, which happen in both Tokyo and Kansai, right, multiple times a year, right, these are probably places where the employers are not going to be so strict about Japanese. And because of the Japanese ability thing, Rikunabi might not be limited use, honestly speaking, because they remember that their bulk is Japanese students, and if the bulk is Japanese students, they expect the users to actually qualify with a certain Japanese ability. So to end off my whole list of presentations, I want to say this. Compared to somebody without an N1 or N2, with an N1 and N2, right? Somebody without an N1 and N2 would probably have to put in 5, if not more times the effort in finding a job in Japan. And there's a high chance that you will have to compromise in some of the conditions that you want in your employer in Japan. But it's not impossible. 5% of the largest economy of the world is not small. So it's not impossible. And around me as well, there are also multiple people with who have actually managed to find work in Japan without Japanese. Sometimes miracles happen, they find a good company whatsoever, but even these miracles are because they had a network. They went to cold email 100 companies, they targeted well, and these kind of things. Not impossible, but you have to work hard. Or you can just work, or you can just learn Japanese, because that may be like the shortcut, the shortcut to actually doing things, right? And as I mentioned before, like, as the statistics themselves already show, each level of the JLPT that you advance, you probably can get at least twice or three times more access to the Japanese job market. So the thing is that maybe in the overall, what do you call it? Like the overall situation, right? Maybe learning Japanese is the shortest shortcut here. And with that, I do want to just to give a few thoughts about like in learning Japanese as somebody who is not a Japanese native speaker. Basically, like I do think, and I'm not a language expert, but just a few bits of advice. Number one, kanji is like, of course, a big issue for many people, right? But like, I hope that if you're learning kanji, you're learning the radical system, like the bushu of like the of kanji. That helps a lot regarding how you split and you digest the kanji. The second thing is, language learning is always proportionate to how much you expose yourself to that language. If you live 90% of your life in English, you only have 10% of like that Japanese, what do you call it, stimulus that you can receive that can help you learn your Japanese. Textbooks are very artificial, and the textbooks are very artificial. But the thing is that the easiest way for you to learn Japanese is actually go out and live life in Japanese, I feel. And so these are just two thoughts that I really want to say. Get out of the bubble, learn some of the structures of Japanese, especially for kanji, it's the bushu system, like the radical system. But also because even after your first job, right, your Japanese is going to be one of the key factors for whether you can actually network and switch jobs as well after your first job. So Japanese is important, but it's not impossible to have a life and to work in Japan without Japanese. So with that, I've come to the end of all my presentations.